Hello, my name is Mary Hall-Rayford, and in honor of Women's History Month, I'm going to read a portion of Chapter 2 from the book Lifting as We Climb, Black Women's Battle for the Ballot Box by Evette, Dionne. Chapter 2, Ain't I a Woman? The Cult of True Womanhood. Despite the wisdom that Harriet Jacobs, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Maria Stewart, and so many other Black abolitionists provided, their opinions were often cast aside by the very anti-slavery societies in America that initially welcomed them in. It was more of a state of the same when the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, BFASS, decided to organize a convention in London in 1840 that would bring abolitionists from around the world together. Sarah Mapps Douglas, Margaretha Forton, and Charlotte Forton Grimke were still active members of the PFASS. They could have been invited to London as delegates for the American Anti-Slavery Society. Although there were 100 female anti-slavery societies in the United States by this time, some founding members of the AASS were staunchly opposed to bringing woman abolitionists to London. One of them, wealthy, New York-based abolitionist Lewis Tappan, even went as far as to say, to put a woman on the committee with men is contrary to the usages of civilized society. An editor of an abolitionist newspaper in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, echoed Tappan's sentiment, writing that Lucretia Mott, the Quaker anti-slavery activist and co-founder of the PFASS, shouldn't travel to London. We should not be surprised if she should so far forget the true dignity of womanhood in her intractable zeal for what she terms principle, as to attempt to take her seat as a delegate in the World's Anti-Slavery Convention. If she does, and mutual distrust, heartburnings, and confusion result from such a step, upon her and her advisers will rest the tremendous onus of putting back the day on the slave's redemption. So though Black and white female abolitionists staged protests and boycotts, Black women were not invited to the World Anti-Slavery Convention, and white women were very reluctantly included. While part of that can be attributed to the racism that ran rampant in some anti-slavery societies, the decision not to attend also came from the delicate social expectations that Black women abolitionists had to navigate. At the time, proper Black women who'd escaped slavery or had been born free were expected to be four things: religious, pure, domesticated, and submissive. That meant that true women would never lose sight of their familial responsibilities, housekeeping, childbearing, and child rearing. Even when Black women like Sarah Mapps Douglas and Charlotte Forton Grimke attended PFASS meetings, they were expected to display ladylike behavior, never to be loud, too bold, too aggressive, or too angry. These were also the lessons that Black girls were learning in schools, including the African Free School, one of the first public schools created for Black students in the late 1700s. Black abolitionist Charles B. Ray took it a step further in 1817 when he wrote in the Colored American, a weekly African American newspaper, that daughters are destined to be wives and mothers. They should, therefore, be taught to know how to manage a house and govern and instruct children. Without this knowledge, they would be lost, and as mothers distracted, their homes would be in disorder, and their children would grow up loose and without character. This attitude about the role of Black women seeped into the abolition movement, so nobody objected to Black women not being chosen as American delegates or even being invited to travel to London to witness the conference. 7 white women were selected as delegates of the United States, but when they and other women arrived at London's densely crowded Freemasons Hall, they were forbidden from being seated on the main floor with male abolitionists. Instead, the women delegates were ushered up to a spectators gallery. They were forced to sit in a curtained area. They couldn't actually see or participate in the debate, but they could hear male delegates heatedly arguing about whether women delegates should be allowed onto the convention floor. When male delegates staged a vote, they overwhelmingly decided to exclude women from the convention. For the remainder of the 9 days, women could simply be attendees, not delegates actively deciding the future of the global abolition movement. Still, the World Anti-Slavery Convention served an ultimately important purpose. It brought together a number of women, including Lucretia Mott and young activist Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who would later become leaders of the American suffrage movement. Being excluded had lit a fire in these 2 women. When they returned to the United States, they vowed to form a society to advocate for the rights of women. It would take more than 8 years for that women's rights convention to come together. In the meantime, abolition remained a focus for many Black women. They continued fighting for abolition while also trying to balance the pressure of working, raising their families, keeping their husbands happy, and being perceived as respectable by their community members. Newspapers, churches, and schools were suggesting that women should only focus on respectable forms of public life, like going to church, taking their children to school, and hosting parties for their neighbors, not orchestrating petitions to the federal government. Many Black women took this message to heart. Abolition was important, of course, and still at the top of many of their minds, but raising well-educated Black children mattered most. Sarah Mapps Douglas, a founding member of the PFASS, was leading a school for Black girls in Philadelphia and also training other public school teachers in the area. More than 40 students from our best families, where their morals and manners were equally subjects of care and deep interest, enrolled in her school, where she taught both practical skills like cooking and sewing and more abstract subjects like science and geometry. Activism still appealed to Douglas, but not enough for her to leave her school for something that many would definitely not consider respectable, a conference for women. On July 19, 1848, about 300 people flocked to the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls, New York, for the first women's rights conference in the United States. Roughly 40 men attended. At the outset, Elizabeth Cady Stanton made the convention's purpose clear. We are assembled to protest against a form of government existing without the consent of the governed, to declare our right to be free as man is free, to be represented in the government which we are taxed to support, to have such disgraceful laws as give man the power to chastise and imprison his wife, to take the wages which she earns, the property which she inherits, and in case of separation, the children of her love, if possible, forever erase from them our statute books. Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and the convention's other organizers were committed to their cause, even as they knew that they were facing an uphill battle. But somehow, women of color were excluded from the Seneca Falls Convention. No Black woman abolitionists attended the convention, most likely because they couldn't afford to travel to Seneca Falls to participate. Frederick Douglass, who spoke on behalf of the American Anti-Slavery Society, was the only Black person who attended the Seneca Falls gathering. Though Black women and their specific needs weren't considered or represented during the convention, its organizers still proposed the Declaration of Sentiments, a document similar to the Declaration of Independence, which declared that all men and women are created equal. and that women should have unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It made 16 specific claims related to suffrage, property rights, and divorce that were treated as a guiding force for how men and their communities should consider and treat women. The Declaration of Sentiments included a ninth and controversial resolution added by Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the twilight before the convention ended. That is the duty of women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. No woman in the United States had the right to vote, so it was revolutionary for Stanton to include this demand in a founding document. When 68 women and 32 men signed the Declaration of Sentiment, there still wasn't consensus around the ninth resolution, much to Stanton's disappointment. It was the one resolution that didn't gain unanimous support, though Frederick Douglass threw his weight behind it. I have never yet been able to find one consideration, one argument, or suggestion in favor of man's right to participate in civil government which did not equally apply to the right of woman, he said. Still, Stanton, Mott, and other organizers were prepared for backlash as news of the Declaration and the suffrage resolution circulated through the press, rippling far beyond Seneca Falls. What did those declarations mean for Black women, many of whom were still enslaved? Douglass couldn't give voice to their specific and unique needs, though he wrote in an issue of the North Star published shortly after the convention. In respect to political rights, we would hold woman to be justly entitled to all we claim for man. We go further and express our conviction that all political rights which it is expedient for man to exercise is equally so for women. All that distinguishes man as an intelligent and accountable being is equally true of woman. And if that government is only just, which governs by the free consent of the governed, there can be no reason in the world for denying to woman the exercise of the elective franchise or a hand in making and administering the laws of the land. Our doctrine is that right is of no sex. I'm going to stop there because this is a fairly lengthy chapter, but I wanted to make my contribution to Women's History Month to understand that rights have always been fought for by those who were passionately involved in organizing and activism, because we know that if we are to truly live a life that is going to provide equality and equity in every area of our lives, Black, white, gay, straight, whatever the case, we must be willing to fight and organize for that right to exist and to sustain it. Again, my name is Mary Hall-Rayford. I'm in East Point, Michigan, and I hope that you'll continue to want to read the rest of this book, Lifting as We Climb, Black Women's Battle for the Ballot Box by Evette, Dionne.